Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to begin by stating that 1821 was a propitious year. It's true Napoleon Bonaparte died that year, but perhaps that's not the reason why. And that was the 100th anniversary of the publication of Montesquieu's Persian Letters. Perhaps that's not the reason why. There were three great births in 1821. Charles Baudelaire, the greatest 19th century French poet, was born that year. Gustave Flaubert, the greatest French novelist in history, if not the greatest novelist in human history, was born that year. And Fyodor Dostoevsky, another contender for the throne of the greatest novelist ever, was born that year. Flaubert and Dostoevsky. It's astonishing. And this afternoon, early this evening, we're about to hear a lecture on Dostoevsky and one of his books in particular, Notes from Underground. I should welcome you to the Montesquieu Forum, which is sponsoring this event. I'm Stuart Warner. I'm the director of the Montesquieu Forum. I'm not only obligated to say, but I'm eager to say that much of the work that we do depends upon the support that we get from the administration of the university, especially my chair, Gina Bacola, and my dean, Cami McBride. And this is the first time I could ever thank an associate dean, Anne-Marie Cusick, who is sitting over here, who has done great work for us. And to show you perhaps the importance of what we do, even our former provost, Lois Becker, has turned up. We're thankful to our many donors who support the Montesquieu Forum, one of whom is Al Harris, an attorney from Chicago, who's here with us today. Our speaker today is Robin Feuer Miller, who is a professor at Brandeis University. She is the Editha Macy Gross Professor of the Humanities. She's also a professor of Russian and comparative literature. She has authored dozens of articles on some of the greats of the Russian classical period, Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Chekhov. She has a great interest in Charles Dickens. She's authored 2 books on the brothers Karamazov, one book on The Idiot. I'm pleased to say I don't appear in it, which is always a very pleasing thing. She's working on a book on a collection of Japanese love letters that has to do with her own family history. I met Professor Miller in March of 1998 at a conference on Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. Her poise, her expertise, her facility with the language and also with Dostoevsky were inspiring. And then I met her at a conference several years later on Frederick Law Olmsted and Alexei de Tocqueville, and I realized that her brilliance did not merely shine on Russian things, but shined on all manner of things, whatever it is she's touched. And I'm proud that she's come to Roosevelt University and to honor us with her presence. Today she's going to be speaking on Dostoevsky's Notes on Underground, The Mouse Who Roared. And is it the mouse who roared or the mouse that roared?
I said that, but it could be.
You'll tell us. So please join me in welcoming Professor Miller to Roosevelt University.
Well, after that, I just feel like going home and not bothering with my lecture, but thank you so much, Stuart. And I'm so honored to be here at Roosevelt University. It's an institution of higher learning whose values I admire so much. And my own university, which was founded just a few years later, really tried to follow suit with some of those same values. I also just have to mention that as a little girl, I knew Eleanor Roosevelt. I hadn't mentioned that to you. I didn't really know her. I have only a hazy, vague, shadowy memory of her. But my father was one of a group of students and young faculty at CCNY in New York, whom Eleanor Roosevelt befriended in a very real way. And later on during World War II, my father got into some political difficulties in the South Pacific on the island of New Caledonia. And Eleanor Roosevelt intervened to help him. And I mean, it's an extraordinary thing when you think of it, because he was just a stray young man that she had met a few times in a group with a lot of other young people at CCNY. But then after the war, when my father got a position teaching philosophy at Vassar College, we would go to visit her. And I have these very hazy memories of, jumping into her swimming pool and so on. I wasn't very interested in her. But I just thought I would mention that since we're here and we're in this beautiful room that has so many stories to tell. I'm honored to have been invited by Stuart Warner. And Stuart is, of course, a major Montesquieu scholar. And in addition to his work on Montesquieu, he has a tremendous range of essays that he has published on philosophers from Plato to Nietzsche, Spinoza. I mean, there's so many, I can't even name them all. And always, he is a colleague whose intellect and wide-ranging, truly wide-ranging learning and sharp wit I have admired for many years, and his warmth, his ability to make a group cohere. Very, very special. Okay, that's the cheery part of this talk, because now we're moving on to a very dark subject, and it's a tough time of year. And as I was working on this, I was thinking, oh dear. So Stuart has asked me to focus on the work, not the author, and to ground my remarks as far as possible within notes from underground themselves. Nevertheless, I am going to briefly, however, mention that just as this work, which I assume some of you have a general knowledge of, and some of you may have read more recently, it's a work that abounds with uncertainties and unanswered questions. And so did Dostoevsky's life. And that's what I wanted to mention to you. All of his most important, possibly influential biographical moments remain obscured and are still contested. For example, was his father murdered by his serfs, or did he have a heart attack? Did Dostoevsky's epilepsy begin when he was a child, or as Freud suggested, when he heard about the death of his father and his moment of sheer joy was superseded quickly by guilt? That's been disproved, but I like to mention that anyway because it's such a colorful argument. Or did his epilepsy develop during his sojourn as a political convict in Siberia? And what was the nature of Dostoevsky's famous spiritual conversion? Was it first a turning to the Christian God, or was it a turning to the Russian people, the Russian peasants? And when did it occur? Did it occur in Siberia, or did it occur earlier, when his death sentence by firing squad turned out at the last minute on the scaffold to have been planned by the Tsar all along as a cruel trick and a sudden reprieve? And in the end, how stable was this famous conversion? In Dostoevsky's notebooks for 1864, the year of Notes from Underground, he writes, quote, "The tragedy of the underground consists of the consciousness of something better and the impossibility of achieving that something. What is there to support those who wish to reform themselves? Consolation? Faith? There is consolation from no one. Faith in no one." Unquote. All these important biographical moments remain, as Kolya Krasotkin from the Brothers Karamazov might put it, shrouded in the mists of obscurity. But although shrouded, they continue to be important. Moreover, just as Dostoevsky was finishing this work, his wife, to whom he had been unfaithful, died after a painful struggle with tuberculosis. He writes, quote, "Masha is lying on the table. Will I ever see Masha again?" Unquote. And he goes on, "To love man like oneself, according to the commandment of Christ, is impossible. The law of personality on earth binds. The ego stands in the way." Unquote. This dark fragment, the first sentence of which, in its stark simplicity, "Masha is lying on the table," could almost be a sentence in a macabre beginning language textbook, reeks of despair and guilt. His wife's corpse on the very table where he undoubtedly wrote and ate. Notes from Underground is a work which has baffled, enraged, or disturbed virtually every generation of readers encountering it since it appeared serially during a particularly tumultuous time, as I've just described, in Dostoevsky's ever-turbulent life. When it appeared, contemporary writers immediately recognized that Dostoevsky was engaging in a polemic with the prominent Russian radical Nikolai Chernyshevsky and his immensely popular utopian novel, What Is to Be Done? A novel that later became the favorite novel of Lenin, who said, "The main influence on me, he completely transformed my outlook," unquote. Today, however, except among specialists in Russian or utopian literature or deeply committed socialists, Chernyshevsky's work, though often cited, remains largely unread, while Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground remains piercingly relevant. Both Chernyshevsky's contemporaries and more recent critics have been unkind in speaking of him, describing him variously as, quote, "the man who stinks of bedbugs," unquote, or a plodding genius whose novel is a grotesque work of art, even while also expressing grudging admiration for him. Dostoevsky, although he is recognized as a novelist of ideas, always maintained that ideas existed within human beings. Hence, however philosophical his novels may be, and however interesting they are to philosophers more generally, it is also crucial to read his creative work in the ways that we read fictional texts, as opposed to works of pure philosophy. And he often put his most cherished ideas into the works of really unsavory characters. And Dostoevsky, who despite his faith also maintained that he would always be a child of intermittent doubt and disbelief, even within the grave, said that if it were proven to him that truth were on one pole and Christ on the other, he would choose Christ. I have tended to elect not to read this as a fanatically Christian statement, although he did sometimes veer in that direction and also in a very nationalist direction at the end of his life, but rather as an indication of Dostoevsky's belief as a writer of fiction that even ideas about truth, goodness, and evil exist within human beings and are not separate from them. It's always a bit off-putting or preachy when writers are called prophetic, as Dostoevsky often is. But two thinkers, Octavio Paz and V.S. Pritchett, have put that same idea into words with a more chilling resonance. Paz, "Dostoevsky is our great contemporary." And Pritchett, "He is still the master because he moves forward with us as our sense of our own danger changes." And I think that's very true right now. And we could go into that in the question period if you want. I hope also in the question period, when we have time to discuss this vexing work more generally, you will attempt to characterize your own experience of reading Dostoevsky. Readings of him are so incredibly varied. The range is immense. Virginia Woolf finds in him something truly new. In 1917, she writes, right around the time of the Russian Revolution, "We have to get rid of the old tune which runs so persistently in our ears, and to realize how little of our humanity is expressed in that old tune. Again and again, we are thrown off the scent in following Dostoevsky's psychology. We constantly find ourselves wondering whether we recognize the feeling that he shows us, and we realize with a start of surprise that we have met it before in ourselves, but we have never spoken of it, and that is why we are surprised." How can we express the kinds of uncertainty that this work engenders in us? Donald Fanger has written that it has attracted many labels. Some have seen it as its author's defense of individualism, others as a case history of neurosis, a work of high comedy, or a specimen of modern tragedy. Dostoevsky's text makes each of these interpretations plausible, but finally escapes them all, unquote. Deborah Martinson reads the work as another Dostoevskian study in shame. Perhaps Joseph Frank said it most powerfully when he wrote, "Few works in modern literature are more widely read than Dostoevsky's Notes from Underground, or so often cited as a key text revelatory of the hidden depths of the sensibility of our time. The term underground man has become part of the vocabulary of contemporary culture, and this culture has now achieved, like Hamlet, Don Quixote, and Faust, the stature of one of the great archetypal literary creations. No book or essay dealing with the precarious situation of modern man would be complete without some allusion to Dostoevsky's explosive figure. Most important cultural developments have claimed the underground man as their own, and when the underground man has not been hailed as a prophetic anticipation, he has been held up to exhibition as a luridly repulsive warning." He goes on to say that the underground man has entered into the very warp and woof of modern culture. And I just wonder, again, when we talk later, is that still true for us? And finally, Robert Louis Jackson, perhaps one of the most penetrating and eloquent of those writing about Dostoevsky, emphasizes Dostoevsky's own words about the Notes on the eve of its publication. He writes, quote, "The work is strong and frank, the truth, yet it is too strange, harsh, wild." Many years ago, I had the pleasure of taking a Dostoevsky course with Jackson, and I wrote a 17-page paper on Notes from Underground. And as I was thinking about my remarks for today, I decided to try to find that old paper. I rummaged in some dusty boxes, and there it was, with a mild comment from Bob Jackson that pages 8 and 9 were interesting. I wrote to Bob, because I kept up with him over the years, that I had found that old paper and that I was coming to talk to all of you about the notes. And his reply included the following. And what I'm really citing this for is that those of you who are students, save your old papers. Save them, because they will tell you something you didn't know about yourself, and save them. Anyway, Bob wrote, "Old days, old times, but although we have galloped forward, Notes from the Underground remains a battlement or bafflement to negotiate. At least that's my experience and remains so. And as to your title," he wrote, "I hear in that title the mouse in Dievushkin and Golyadkin, bottled up for an eternity, finally getting their say. Hey, that's me." Those are primary characters in two of Dostoevsky's pre-Siberian works, Poor People and White Nights, and The Double. As for Jackson, just a little postscript, he turned 98 last month. He lives alone in an old farmhouse, very old farmhouse with steep stairs, sleeps upstairs. Just finished a book on Chekhov, an inspiration of a life lived alone, but not underground. And as for mice, the hero of Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, 1868, is Lev Nikolaevich, that's Tolstoy's name and patronymic, with Lev meaning lion. And the full name of the idiot is Lev Nikolaevich Myshkin, which is a derivative of the Russian word for mouse. Dostoevsky's mice have a mighty roar indeed. What are some of the many burdens, notes from underground, places on us, its readers? After all, the project of any major work of fiction is to pose and to formulate questions that will haunt us, not necessarily to answer them. Who is the nameless underground man, this mouse that roared, whose voice still rings in our ears? He defines himself as the antithesis of the normal man, who has sprung not from nature, but astonishingly from a, quote, test tube. This is almost mysticism, gentlemen. And this, quote, test tube begotten man sometimes capitulates to his antithesis to such an extent that for all his intense sensibility, he frankly considers himself a mouse and not a man. I grant you, it is an intensely conscious mouse, but it's a mouse all the same, whereas the other is a man. So consequently, etc., unquote. And what are the qualities of this mouse? Hurt feelings, a desire for pure vengeance unrelated to the satisfying of justice, spite, a desire to play dirty tricks, the tendency to accumulate insoluble questions and drown in them. When, as he calls them, men of action, show their scorn for him, quote, all that is left for it to do is dismiss that scorn with a disdainful wave of its little paw and with a smile of simulated contempt, and to, quote, scurry back ingloriously into its hole. There, in its stinking, disgusting, subterranean hole, our hurt, ridiculed, and beaten mouse plunges into cold, venomous, and above all, unremitting spite, unquote. It will remember everything for 40 years and will forgive nothing. And it will find delight. By the way, the name of his enemy, Zverkov, in part 2, comes from the Russian word for zver, wild animal. Dialogism and polyphony. Mikhail Bakhtin, the prominent Russian philosopher-critic, saw as the defining markers of Dostoevsky's fiction its dialogism and its polyphony. Characters are always in dialogue with each other, but perhaps more important, with themselves. And their many voices, inner and intra-character, sound throughout his creative works, not in harmony, but in the tones of a great, often dissonant polyphony, an endless fugue in which it is difficult to prioritize one voice over another in a constantly shifting score. Take, for example, the very first paragraph of Notes from Underground. It reads, I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. No, I'm not a pleasant man at all. I believe there's something wrong with my liver. However, I don't know a damn thing about my liver. Neither do I know whether there's anything wrong with me. I'm not under medical treatment, though I do respect medicine and doctors. If I refuse to be medically treated, it's only out of spite. My liver hurts me. You get the drift. Is he sick? Is he spiteful? Is he actually superstitious given his faith in medicine and respect for doctors? Can he explain himself to us or not? Why does he refuse medical treatment? And most important, if we follow the quote-unquote editor Dostoevsky, who is also a fictional character, though he gives you notes down at the bottom, if you follow his clues from the footnote on the first page, is his dialogic condition a manifestation of his freedom of choice or a result of inexorable determinism? Hence, on this first page, our novelist of ideas is, as expected, representing innumerable ideas, but always through the astigmatic lens of character, so that it becomes impossible to separate a particular idea from its embeddedness in a particular physical human being. A page or two later, the underground man observes, quote, it ended by my almost believing, and perhaps I did actually believe, that this was probably my normal condition. Did he believe it or not? He almost believed. Perhaps I did actually believe. Where are we? The Crystal Palace. Toward the end of part 1, the underground man, in his unceasing dialogue and occasional rants against his reader, those gentlemen, his interlocutors, or perhaps himself, rages. You believe in the Crystal Palace, forever indestructible. That is to say, in one at which you won't be able to stick out your tongue, even by stealth. Well, perhaps I am afraid of this. Well, perhaps I am afraid of this palace just because it is made of crystal and is forever indestructible, and just because I shan't be able to poke my tongue at it even by stealth. What is this Crystal Palace? Is it essentially no more than its degradations? The hen coop, the anthill, the block of model flats? Is the term Crystal Palace simply part of Dostoevsky's ongoing polemic with the French and Russian utopian socialists and radicals? I expect Stuart and others can help me here. Or with Dostoevsky's more local opponent, Nikolai Chernyshevsky? An interesting footnote. Chernyshevsky wrote his novel, What is to be Done, while imprisoned in solitary confinement in the Peter and Paul fortress in 1862-63. The same place where Dostoevsky himself had spent a year of solitary confinement a decade earlier, before being sent in chains to serve as a convict in Siberia, a fate very similar to Chernyshevsky's. The potent symbol of the Crystal Palace first arose in Dostoevsky's mind when he traveled to London in 1862 and saw the famous actual Crystal Palace at the Second London World's Fair. This magnificent glass and cast iron building had been designed by Sir Joshua Paxton, himself the largely self-educated head gardener at Kew Gardens, and became for Dostoevsky what Frank calls, quote, an image of the unholy spirit of modernity. And in his imagination, this spirit takes on the form of the monstrous beast whose coming was prophesied in the apocalypse, unquote. Dostoevsky writes in a work called Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, a non-fictional account of his travels the year before Notes from Underground. The Crystal Palace is some sort of biblical illustration, some prophecy of the apocalypse fulfilled before your eyes. You feel that one must have perpetual spiritual resistance and negation so as not to surrender, not to submit, not to bow, that is, not to accept its existence as one's ideal. Chernyshevsky's response was not unexpectedly the opposite. And although he never has his characters explicitly name the Crystal Palace, remember he's in prison in his novel, his character Vera dreams of, quote, the palace on Sydenham's Hill, iron and glass, which embodies only happiness, not suffering, unquote. But chapter 10 of part 1, that's what I'm focusing on here, from Notes from Underground, forces the reader to confront a whole host of new complexities. Yes, there's the image of the Crystal Palace as a degradation of the human spirit, as nothing more than an anthill. But something else lurks in this chapter as well, and I don't know if when you read it you felt some confusion. A garbled image of an entirely different Crystal Palace that emerges, a true Crystal Palace, the one that, quote, may be just an ideal dream, says the underground man. It may be against all the laws of nature. I may have invented it, but what do I care whether it's against the laws of nature, unquote. This chapter disintegrates into a muddle of utter contradictions. Does the underground man hate the Crystal Palace? Does he dream lovingly of the Crystal Palace? What is occurring? Here we come up against a riddle. As you may know, the censors removed parts of this chapter in which the underground man juxtaposed his vision of the true Crystal Palace with that of the false one, the one actually in London that represented to Dostoevsky the ideas of the socialists. The underground man tells his readers, quote, I will not accept as the crown of all my desires a big house with model flats for the poor on a lease of 9,999 years and in case of emergency with the dental surgeon Wagenheim on a signboard, unquote. The censors found that the idealism in chapter 10 was too close physically to the blasphemy. At the time, Dostoevsky complained to his brother, what is it with the censors? Are they in a conspiracy against the government? It would have been better not to print the penultimate chapter at all than to print it in its present form. The censors, those swine, approved the places where I mocked everything and sometimes blasphemed for effect, but where I deduced the need for faith and Christ from all these, that they prohibited. That was a letter to his brother in 1864. So here's the creative riddle. Why, when famous and secure as a writer, Dostoevsky could have restored the missing parts of the garbled chapter, did he not do so? Thoughts? He came to agree with the censors. He realized that the present structure worked better and led more effectively into part 2 of the notes, where the polemic with Chernyshevsky continues not through ideological, philosophical arguments, but through a reworking of favorite plot lines. Other thoughts? Again, this is something to speculate about. As I said before, great literature poses questions. It doesn't answer them. It leaves them for us to consider. We come now to chapter 11, and this is the chapter of this vexed work that has, in my own thinking about Dostoevsky, engaged me most powerfully. It begins with a dissonant, simultaneously unpolyphonic hymn and curse of the underground, which, as you know, translates the underground more literally to under the floorboards, podpolya, under the floor, a place where mice actually live. The word underground, or podpolya, occurs 4 times in the short paragraph. Gradually, the underground man's rantings and self-contradictions and arguments with his audience, these gentlemen, these readers, give way to a meditation on the nature of confession. Quote, "Such confessions which I am about to make are not printed, nor given to other people to read. There are certain things in a man's past which he does not divulge to everybody, but perhaps only to his friends. Again, there are certain things he will not divulge even to his friends. He will divulge them perhaps only to himself, and that too as a secret. But finally, there are things which he's afraid to divulge even to himself. And every decent man has quite an accumulation of such things in his mind." Unquote. At this point, Dostoevsky leaves Chernyshevsky behind, and in my view, his target for much of the rest of the work becomes Rousseau. The Rousseau of the Confessions, 1782, a work which Dostoevsky joined the underground man in despising for what he saw as its terrible dishonesty. By the way, Tolstoy loved Rousseau, and even as a young man wore a portrait of Rousseau on his lapel. The underground man writes, "I particularly want to put the whole thing to the test, to see whether I can be absolutely frank with myself and not be afraid of the whole truth. Let me add, by the way, Heine says that true autobiographies are almost impossible, and that a man will certainly tell a lot of lies about himself. In his view, Rousseau told a lot of lies about himself in his confessions, and told them deliberately out of vanity. I'm sure Heine is right. I can understand perfectly how sometimes one tells all sorts of lies about oneself out of sheer vanity. I can even perfectly understand that sort of vanity. But Heine had in mind a man who made his confessions to the public." Unquote. The underground man goes on to say that he, the underground man, is writing only for himself. He then informs us that writing it down may make him feel easier in my mind. Heal him, we wonder, and that he has been oppressed by an incident that happened long ago. Remember, part 1 is in the 1860s, part 2 is looking back at the 40s, which he likens to, quote, "an annoying tune you can't get out of your head." Is this where Virginia Woolf found her Dostoevsky metaphor about the old tune? The annoying tune? As we know, a somewhat similar incident involving desire, guilt, and shame with a young girl is what had also motivated Rousseau to write his confession. Chapter 11, in each of its paragraphs, stands for me as a kind of oblique Dostoevskian manifesto on the paradoxical nature of confession, and it plays out in some form in most of his subsequent works. Written confessions or publicly uttered confessions are not believed when they're true, but carry great narrative force when they're false, and are more likely to be believed. Most important written confessions, such as Rousseau's, seek self-exoneration and a dishonest brand of self-forgiveness, as well as unearned forgiveness from others. In my view, Dostoevsky particularly hated part one of the Confessions, and the underground man's disdain for, it comes up elsewhere in the notes, l'homme de la nature et de la vérité also connects to the same part one of Rousseau's Confessions. As part one closes, we are launched back from the more radical 1860s into the 1840s, and the polemic switches from philosophic discourse into an engagement with popular literary plots and themes of the more romantic 1840s, the duel, the visit of young intellectuals to a brothel, the romanticization of the prostitute. But not surprisingly, Dostoevsky, through his underground narrator, explodes each of these somewhat tired, cliched old tunes and makes them so shocking that they have piercing relevance for us even today. The mouse that roared in part one railed against modernity and utopian philosophical ideological discourse that was divorced from concrete human action. But what of that mouse's roar in part two? In general, his target shift generally from the philosophical to the literary. Part two begins with the citation of an 1846 poem by the popular civic poet Nekrasov, which encapsulates a frequent theme of the early 19th century in Europe and Russia, the trope of the man who falls in love with a prostitute and saves her. Nekrasov's romantic stanza, however, is abruptly cut off by the underground man at its most heightened moment, if you recall, at the beginning of part two. Quickly in your hands you hid your face, unconscious of the flood of tears that came, shaken and indignant at your own disgrace. And then the underground man inserts, etc., etc. Just as Chernyshevsky's novel, with which Dostoevsky polemicized, is largely unread these days, so is Nekrasov's poem, which was so immensely popular at the time. Chernyshevsky said of it, "It literally makes me sob." And it's an interesting aside. When Chernyshevsky was in prison, he gave Nekrasov the manuscript of What Is to Be Done, because by then Nekrasov was an editor of one of the main journals. And Nekrasov, to his horror, lost the manuscript in a hackney sleigh, but he was able, by placing an ad in the newspaper, to get it back. So I just thought I'd mention that. Nekrasov's poem tells the story of a prostitute who shamefully, guiltily narrates her story to a young man who saves her and eventually marries her. What happens to this theme, popular not only in Russia, but with writers like Eugène Sue, Victor Hugo, and Georges Sand, and to some extent Charles Dickens, when it develops under Dostoevsky's pen? Lisa's story is swallowed up by the underground man's self-narration and his cruel, sadomasochistic, greedy impulse, not to alleviate any shame she might feel, but to increase it, to tell her own story with ghastly predictions of illness, poverty, and death. He literally deprives her of a voice. Vanity, laced with the fear of appearing ridiculous, vanity and the fear of appearing ridiculous engulf him in his encounters with Lisa. In his mid-20s, he's consumed by his reading of romantic texts, which feed his sense of self-importance, yet he's crippled by his mouse-like furtive shyness and an innate sense of inferiority amongst his office mates. As Joseph Frank trenchantly observes, as a result of imbibing the European culture popular in Russia in the 1840s, the underground man has lost any capacity for simple and direct human feeling in relation to others. Instead, his vanity has become inflated so to a degree out of all proportion to his actual social situation. And what of he describes them, the quote, vile amusements that the underground man pursues. He tells us, quote, in solitude, at night, secretly, fearfully, filthily, with a feeling of shame, unquote. This is a confession, in my view, of wandering the streets at night, and it pops up in another of Dostoevsky's novel called The Insulted and Injured, which is also in a kind of angry dialogue with Rousseau. Anyway, this is a confession, in my view, of wandering the streets at night, and just as Rousseau described in his Confessions, of quite literally public masturbation in the dark. From here, the underground man moves on to the expression of his desire to be a man of honor and to restore that honor through engaging in a duel. He wishes to parade on Nevsky Prospect, but sees himself, quote, darting along like a groundling, a mouse, in the most unbecoming manner imaginable amongst the people on the pavement. This darting human mouse imagines that people see him as just a fly, an odious, obscene fly. Yet to his opponent, the officer, he imagines he's seen not even as a mouse or a fly, but just, quote, empty space. The duel begins. Our underground man, in not stepping aside on the pavement, considers himself victorious and returns home to sing Italian arias to himself. He then falls into a prolonged state of isolated daydreaming, imagining himself as a kind of Byronic Manfred. In an earlier work, another nameless dreamer of Dostoevsky's had articulated the notion that the dreamer is the artist of his own life. In chapter 3 of part 2, after the underground man has invited himself to Zverkov's goodbye party, we finally get through the underground man's nighttime dream, which he tells us about, an account of his miserable childhood, of how he was bullied years earlier by these same friends, and a kind of literary sympathy for him on our part might start to emerge, which lasts throughout the subsequent party and all the way to the brothel, until the moment when he sees himself in the mirror with the prostitute Lisa and thinks to himself, I'm glad I seem repulsive to her. Why does he want to repel her? Lisa embodies the romantic trope of the prostitute that the hero should wish to rescue. She's lovely, intelligent, honorable, pragmatic. She's capable of love and tender affection. She chides him for being too bookish, even as he is being sadistically cruel to her in painting a dire picture of her possible fate, that of being buried, apropos of wet snow, in a watery, slushy grave, thereby mercilessly degrading Nekrasov's romantic imagery and turning the wet snow into a harbinger of death and decay. He says, your grave will be full of slush and dirt and wet snow. They will fill in your grave with wet blue clay and go off to a pub. That will be the end of your memory on earth. Other women have children to visit their graves, fathers, husbands, but there will be neither tears nor sighs nor any remembrance for you. No one in the world will ever come to you, dirt and mud, though you knock at your coffin lid at night when the dead arise, unquote. She weeps. His dreadful prose poem, envisioning her lonely death, has wrought its horror upon her. And I just want to mention that this excerpt, and I only noticed it while working on this little presentation, has very strong affinities with Ivan Karamazov's later preface to his famous prose poem of the Grand Inquisitor, which some of you might have read, in which he cites the apocryphal text of the Virgin's descent into hell as an occasion to reflect on what it means to be completely forgotten by God. The underground man's subsequent moment of genuine sympathy for Lisa is short-lived and is unsurprisingly quickly overtaken by malicious impulses and ugly daydreams. He says, well, in short, here I got myself entangled in European George Sandian inexpressibly noble subtleties, but now you're mine. You are my creation. You are pure and beautiful. You are my beautiful wife. And then we live happily ever after, go abroad, etc., etc. In short, I got so thoroughly fed up with myself in the end that I finished up by sticking out my tongue at myself. No matter how much Lisa embodies the full potential of the literary trope of the prostitute to be rescued by the socially conscious young man, the underground man can show her no mercy. When she comes to him, he flings that romantic trope in her face. I wanted power. Power was what I wanted then. I wanted sport. I wanted to see you cry. I wanted to humiliate you, to make you hysterical. And do you know what I really wanted? What I wanted was that you should all go to hell. His tirade goes on, and Lisa realizes, because she's so, perceptive, she realizes his deep unhappiness. It is the prostitute who offers understanding, pity, resilience, and love, both spiritual and physical. Is this variation on a theme even more romantic than its original version that he's mocking? At any rate, the underground man finds his sadomasochistic revenge in putting a 5-ruble note, low payment, into her hand. But in this final duel, she emerges victorious, since she leaves it on the table. He rushes out into the wet snow to try to find her, to no avail. The underground man ends as he began, roaring from his mouse hole, lamenting his dependence and that of the human race more generally upon finding its solutions to life in books. Quote, leave us alone without any books, and we shall at once get confused, lose ourselves in a maze. We shall not know what to cling to, what to hold on to. We are stillborn, and for a long time we have been begotten, not by living fathers. His rantings end where they began, in the dark cellar, with the evocation of test tube begotten men. Or do they? Our editor, the fictional Dostoevsky, intervenes here and tells us that the memoirs of this paradoxicalist continue, but that we may stop here. Well, why does he stop there? What Dostoevsky initially began as a polemical response to Chernyshevsky's novel has become inadvertently a cri de coeur for modernity and for the human condition in our time. And Masha is lying on the table. That's the end. Thank you. And I really welcome questions. And if you want to jump in, or I probably won't be able to give good, solid philosophical answers to questions, but I can try. But this is a very, very strange work, and something that also was odd was I said over and over how he represents us, now in our time, in some ways, the human condition in our time. And yet I was looking at some of the most recent books on Dostoevsky that have come out in the last couple of years that go through with chapters, and a number of them don't deal with Notes from Underground, which I thought was really interesting. There are a couple of books that have come out that I really think are fantastic, and I thought, what did he have to say? And I don't know why that is either. Yeah.
Maybe completely misses the point, but is his disappointment with life due to his expectation of life? Mm-hmm. He has these utopian expectations.
Well, that's a great question, and that is the point of view that there's a lot of argument about this work, and that's the point of view actually that Joseph Frank takes extremely eloquently. If you're interested in intellectual history and the philosophers of the time and so on, I strongly urge you to look at Joseph Frank's. It's a 5-volume biography of Dostoevsky, but there is a single 1-volume condensed version of it, but it's the version that focuses on those years. It's called The Stir of Liberation. And Frank argues what you're suggesting, that what he's showing is that the underground man is the logical result of all of these theories. It's what you would get if you took these theories of the utopian socialists seriously. You would end up with an underground man. I have a shift. I greatly admire Frank's view, and when I read his chapters on Notes from Underground, I'm swayed by them, but then when I move away from them, I'm not sure again. But yeah, does that address your question?
Well, not sure in what way. I mean, how do you view it?
Well, I mean, I think it's really clever to say that the Underground Man is the logical result of the theories of the utopian socialists who were emphasizing a world without God, and where society would be organized and so on. That, I think it's a compelling way to read this work, but I'm sort of more in tune with the point of view of someone like Robert Jackson or Donald Fanger, who see him as, trying to struggle against all of this. But it's a shifting canvas, and that's part of the problem. And the other part of the problem is when you read the work, almost every paragraph has 2 or 3 sentences that you want to quote, and they all sort of say something different. Yeah.
I think of the polemic as being not just with the utopian socialists, but with Western capitalism.
With what?
Western capitalism.
Absolutely, with Western capitalism too, and he writes about Malthus, and yeah, absolutely, you're absolutely right. And I didn't mention that at all, but you're absolutely correct.
The Crystal Palace.
Yeah.
Being a technological.
The Crystal Palace was, on the one hand, a technological miracle, and it could provide solutions for human suffering, and people live in cleanliness and light. And the person who developed it was someone of modest background and not noble beginnings and so on. But yes, but it also is capitalism, and Dostoevsky. I mean, his work, Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, is just full of his. Yeah, it's
in that direction. And so when you started with saying about ties with today, he really rejects the notion of progress. And
he absolutely does.
And has someone will destroy keep the Crystal Palace, break it just for the hell of it. And I just think it is really important that today in particular, for students of history to really not accept the notion of progress, to really fight against it, because as we see, there's a lot of things in which we don't make progress at all.
Yeah, and to elaborate on your point, it really began to hit me back when the pandemic began, in February of 2020, right then, when we were all worried but not in lockdown yet. And I was trying to write something about crime and punishment, and I became just really focused on the fact that Dostoevsky, over and over and over, but explicitly when he comes to write crime and punishment, his first idea for writing this novel is, I wanted to write a novel about a young man who succumbs to the unfinished ideas in the air. So all ideas are unfinished, and they're always unfinished, and they exist within characters, and ideas are unfinished. And then as I began working on crime and punishment, and I had written about it before and had sort of had a feeling about this, but then this time around, it really hit me over the head. Not only is the novel, and really all of his work, about unfinished ideas in the air and the way we succumb to them and what that does to us, and that ideas are always unfinished. But not only that, he conjoins the notion of ideas and viruses. And he says like in the epilogue to Crime and Punishment, viruses, they didn't really know about viruses then, but they knew that disease traveled through the air. And he has a sense over and over that these unfinished ideas are traveling through the air, literally, like disease, like viruses, and are infecting you. And at the end of Crime and Punishment, which really emanates in some ways from Notes from Underground, Raskolnikov has this terrible dream that everybody is infected with a virus where they believe that they are the only one who knows the right course of action. And everyone is infected with this. And they are kind people. They weep because nobody is listening to them. And well, anyway, it kind of, shook me up. Yeah.
During my reading, I couldn't stop laughing.
I know, he's very funny.
I wondered if you could speak on the intentionality of humor in the work and how it functions.
The what?
The intentionality of humor in the
Oh,
work and how
absolutely.
it functions.
And he will put humor in the most incredible tragic scenes in his novel. Again, in Crime and Punishment, there's a character who dies and there's a funeral meal celebrating him, and it's a terribly sad, tragic situation for his family, who are going to be out on the streets starving to death. And the scene is highly comic, highly comic. Or there's, he's very funny, and it's always surprised me that Dostoevsky never wrote a play, because all of his big novels, even this a little bit in the scene at the party, before they go to the brothel, but in all of his novels there are these big scandal scenes where something tragic and terrible is happening, and you're kind of laughing your way all the way through it. And Bakhtin called this, but I don't think it needs to have a label, Menippean satire. And in The Idiot, there's a hilarious scene where one of the characters, who is quite unsavory but also embodies a lot of Dostoevsky's most cherished ideas, narrates a long story about cannibals and whether it's more of a sin to eat a baby or a clergyman. Anyway, it's full of that kind of thing. Oh, yes, sorry, didn't see you.
I was wondering if, and this might be a bias, but I was wondering if there's some sense in which, despite his explicit criticism of Rousseau, there's some kind of agreement there. And he seems to be parodying the entirety of Western historical and philosophical canon, going back to Alexander's Great, and he's critical of the way that books influence people in the way that Rousseau talks about in Emile, as well as in the discourse on Eisenstein.
That would be a very interesting line of work to pursue, because certainly Dostoevsky's response to Rousseau is in part so passionate because there's so much self-recognition there. And he reworks certain episodes from Rousseau, the same episode really, over and over and over again. That would be a very interesting thing to look into. He was fascinated by confessions, and there are authentic confessions that take place. But there are also so many inauthentic ones. Yeah. Rousseau was so important to all of these Russians. They all felt they had to take a strong stance about him one way or another. And as I mentioned, Tolstoy admired him so much. But Tolstoy emphasized other works of Rousseau that, more things like the social contract and the other writings of Rousseau, not the Confessions so much. Stuart.
Three noticeable things about the work. One, he's nameless.
He's nameless.
Two, he's feckless.
He's what?
Feckless.
Feckless?
Yeah, he's feckless. He's incapable of achieving anything. Think of the lieutenant, and he's unable to get himself even to bump against him.
Except he thinks that he won that duel with the lieutenant.
Yes. Yes. In his mind.
In his mind.
But there seems to
Yeah.
be this
Well,
disconnect between the mind and the body,
yeah.
and he's also a civil servant.
And yes, and Dostoevsky has a series of stories that it is fascinating to read together. And two of them he wrote before he went to Siberia. He wrote, one of them. White Nights is is about another nameless dreamer. And White Nights he writes right shortly before he's sent to Siberia. And it's in White Nights where the nameless dreamer says that a dreamer is the artist of his own life. And he is a real artist. I mean, and he also has a single encounter with a woman. The structure is very much the same as Notes from Underground, Nastenka. And then he kind of lives off that encounter, we assume, endlessly. Then comes, after Siberia, Notes from Underground. But then there are two more works. There is an absolutely devastating work called Krutkaya, A Gentle Creature. Have any of you encountered that story? So this is another nameless dreamer who has retreated to his hole because he failed to fight in a duel in the army, and he's ashamed. And he becomes a pawnbroker, which is not a good thing in Russia at the time. And again, the whole story is built around an incident with a very young girl whom he marries. And the whole narration is, again, it's like Notes from Underground. It's very, very similar. And that story is written in the 1870s. So there's a story in the late 40s, story early 60s, story in the 70s, and then there's a fourth story with a nameless dreamer called The Dream of a Ridiculous Man. And that is a story that engages in the same way that Notes from Underground does, with a huge range of thinkers. And it is a fascinating, fascinating story. And it ends, and he's closer to death at this point, Dostoevsky. That story ends in a kind of different way than the other three stories that all end in the same way. And I don't want to spoil it for you, but it's a really powerful story. And this guy is also a nameless dreamer. Did you have a question?
Oh, yeah. A couple. I don't want to ramble though. The way that he sort of mocks sanity and attempts to communicate with oneself even and one's own narrative, and sort of seems hopeless about progress. It's almost like human history resets as every, baby born, depending on the structures around them. Is it kind of like he's saying that there can be like a good transformative power of doubt?
Yes, but he's not acknowledging it in this work.
Are there works?
I mean, this work really is, it's a peculiar work, and it lingers there in this lopsided state because of it having been mangled by the censors. And Dostoevsky never restored it. But in other works, I think, in many of his novels, more than in these shorter works that I just mentioned, something positive and transformative does occur. Yeah.
Outside of words, just his of Chekhov's longer pieces is Cycle and Island, and does censor work for the government later.
Chekhov does that.
Chekhov.
Yeah.
And you demarcated Dostoevsky's sort of life and work before and after, but I haven't read anything about him spending a year in solitude. And from a contemporary perspective, that can be severely damaging.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more with you about that because, it's generally said, it was while Dostoevsky was in Siberia that he had this conversion, and he has a wonderful, wonderful book that is a novel called Notes from the House of the Dead that's about his prison experience. It is a great work of prison literature, and it's cast as a novel, but a lot of it is autobiographical. But I agree with you. My feeling is that the year in solitary confinement was what really did a number on him. Because, and then going to the scaffold and thinking he was going to die and not dying. And when he comes back to his cell that night, he writes a bunch of, before he's going to be sent to Siberia, he goes back to his old cell and he writes a bunch of letters. And I think that those letters really show him sort of making a life plan, and that he is, by God, he's going to have a conversion. I mean, I agree with you that year in confinement was just brutal. Whereas, the going to Siberia in chains was very hard, but he did meet people there. And on the way, he encountered one of the wives of one of the Decembrists who had all been sent out to exile out there. And he encountered this woman, Madame von Wiesena, and he talked with her, and she gave him her New Testament. And you weren't allowed to have books in the prison, but he smuggled it in and he kept it under his mattress the whole time. And so that's also a very important thing, because the only book that he had for all those years was the New Testament. And he read it and read it and read it. But I still think that year and those letters right after the mock execution were crucial, absolutely crucial for him. Yeah.
But I still, you have to resist to a certain degree an autobiographical interpretation.
No,
of his
yeah.
work.
No, I didn't, we shouldn't interpret this.
I'm not
Yeah.
suggesting you did. It's just that, the themes that he talks about are so current, are so part of, the Russian conversation as well as the European conversation. So I'm always hesitant about that, except for everything goes to the extreme. But he clearly went to the extreme before, and this took him even, that is the Russian thing, and that is the Dostoevsky, is to take the thought to the absolute,
To the end.
extreme.
But once you get there, then you are subject all over again to doubt. I mean, that's what kept happening to him over and over. And this is not to dwell on the autobiography, but he writes to Madame von Wiesena later after he gets out of prison, and he says, "I will always be a child of doubt and disbelief, even in my grave." And he thanks her, but
It's just one of the essential questions.
yeah,
As
he
you raised it, is the
yeah.
conversion real, or because
You just never know.
you just
Yeah.
never know, because
Yeah.
the exploration of reasons not to believe are so strong, and the only response
yes.
is really the metaphor,
And
right,
that's
the Grand Inquisitor, and it's so beautiful that.
well, and I mean, right. It all just starts over again. Yeah.
I also think that he's very, modern in, you use the phrase, building your own narrative. I mean, he really has a sense of, life as a performative activity.
Yeah.
Or, that what you said about, you used a quote where people are
Polyphony,
reflected in
yeah.
novels and they act as if they're in novels.
Yeah.
It's hard to, and that whole notion. I mean, now we would have even more, in terms of social media, but that people's personalities are not independent, not just of the social organization, but of cultural production. That
Yeah.
we're constantly rewriting our narrative.
Well, and if you, like, again, to go back to Crime and Punishment, because it's a novel and you can sink your teeth into different scenes, but like when Raskolnikov is talking to the great detective, Porfiry Petrovich, whose last name we never get to know, he asks him in one crucial scene, do you believe in God? And Raskolnikov says no, and they talk about it. Then later, do you believe in God? In another scene, yes. I mean, it's all, the thing that has always engaged me most powerfully with Dostoevsky are the different layers of his narration. And this is a first-person narrative, so it's different. But most of his novels, not all, are written in a third-person voice, but it's not a simple, omniscient narrator. It's a narrator who knows some things and not others, and is pretty reliable, but sometimes at crucial moments he's not so reliable. And it's those layers of narration that I find so endlessly interesting about his work. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about this really interesting contrast, the symbol of the Crystal Palace as this structure that replicates physically something that's meant to conceal its interior and yet reveals it, and the underground, which is
It's the opposite. Yeah. I mean,
but it's the locus of revelation, in this word, even as it is also a place that we associate with keeping something hidden.
it's incredible, isn't it? Because the Crystal Palace is it's sometimes described as iron and glass or aluminum and glass. And it's one of the first modern skyscrapers. And have you ever seen the replicas of it? Absolutely beautiful. And it was to be also a palace in the World's Fair. It was a palace of industry, world industry, and all the different, and it was an amazing thing. And he's saying, no, I'm going to go not in the earth, because the earth was something else entirely. That's why underground is not a good translation. It's under the floorboards in that space, that completely confined, airless, horrendous, dirty, mouse-ridden space that he wants to be. The earth in Dostoevsky's thinking is something very different, and more as he, he feels the tragedy of modern man is that we are men of the pavement, and we need to embrace the soil, and actually some of his writings, which are kind of off-the-wall journalism, early pieces about the soil, really resonate with our worries today about the impoverishment of the nutrients in the soil. And I don't mean to get into his autobiography. I mean, these are always writings of his that I hated to read because they were so nutty, but they really resonate now when you read them.
Well, there's a Russian myth about the earth and Mother Earth.
Mother Earth, exactly. I mean, Woody Allen captured it perfectly. And I sometimes ask my students, I mean, have you ever laid down on the earth? I mean, yeah, so, yes.
Yeah, I was gonna ask, it seems like we should have like updated, like there should be updated theories about it too, because
You know what? I have a hearing problem and hearing aids.
Would you stand up and speak
Well,
up?
I don't know how to get too close to you.
How y'all doing today, everybody? They should have like an updated theory for it, like updated. That way everybody can be like real informed on it about it, and and break it down for everybody to like understand it, because basically like reading, and we all working together. And it's a good story too as well. They should like make sure they up to date too. That way they can know like if there need to be any changes or not, you know. They're
Yeah.
available.
Yeah.
And
Well,
good.
yeah, I think it goes back to, and you know, I think it's true of any great writer, really. It's certainly true of Shakespeare. I mean, they are evolving and changing with us and things. I mean, I can remember when I was a graduate student and I read Chekhov. And now when I read Chekhov, and our world has changed, I see a different Chekhov there. And you were mentioning Sakhalin, and you read something, and then you read what he has to say about nature, electricity. I mean, it is really uncanny. Things that I mean, if you think, that's why it's interesting for you to save your old papers, you who are students, and you read them in 30 or 40 years, and it's a different world. I mean, who knows what that world will be, but it's sure to change.
Maybe we have time for one more question.
One more question? Last question?